In this lesson, you'll learn how to build a table view, make network requests, and parse JSON in Swift. Additionally, you'll learn the MVVM pattern, model view view model, which you can use in your own projects to ensure you don't end up with massive view controllers. You'll end the lesson with an app that pulls data from the iTunes RSS feed and the skills that you need to build your next REST app in Swift. We're going to get started by creating a single view application. And this app is going to be called Top Movies, and we're going to pull data from the iTunes RSS feed. So we'll call it Top Movies. Make sure that the language is Swift and the device is set to iPhone. And go ahead and create it wherever you'd like. Okay, so here we have the skeleton of our app. You'll notice that there's an app delegate, a view controller, and a main storyboard, just like in Objective-C. We're going to jump into the main storyboard here. And to get started, we will drag a table view out onto our view controller. Okay, and then we're going to create one prototype cell so that we can configure how our cell will look. I'm going to make it a basic cell here. So that'll just give us a title on our cell. And then let's jump into the view controller. Okay, so our view controller already subclasses UI view controller, and we want to make it a UI table view data source. So we'll do that. And you'll notice the Swift errors telling us that it doesn't conform to the protocol. So of course we need to implement a couple methods. So we'll do table view number of rows in section. You'll notice this looks a little bit different from the implementation in Objective-C. In Swift we have functions. And in the cell for row index path, we're going to say the cell equals tableview.dequeue reusable cell with identifier cell for index path and the index path that's coming in. Of course, we need to return that cell. And since dequeue reusable cell with identifier returns a standard object, we need to cast it to a UI table view cell using the as syntax. Okay, so we'll jump back into our storyboard and make sure the identifier is set to cell, and then we'll run it on the simulator. Okay, it looks like I have a couple build errors here. If you see these yourself, I think the solution is to just clean your project, and you can also delete the derived data. So if you go to Window, Organizer, and select your project that's open, you can delete the derived data just like this. And that should do it. Let's go ahead and run again and see if that works. And indeed it does. But we're not getting any data in our table view. So we need to go to the storyboard and connect our data source, of course, to our view controller, just like we would in Objective-C. Okay, so now we see a title that's appearing. I don't really like how this looks, so let's go in and make it look a little bit prettier. So I'm going to go to Editor, Embed in Navigation Controller, and this gives us the ability to set a title on our view. And then I'm just going to reposition this so my storyboard is easier to look at. I'm going to set a title by double-clicking the navigation bar, call it Top Movies, and then we'll run it again to see. And that looks pretty good. So next we'll go back into our view controller and let's set some text on that cell. So I'm going to create a configure cell function. So configure cell, pass in the cell for row and index path, and we'll pass in the index path. So of course then we need to define that function, call it configure cell, and we're going to pass in a UI table view cell, it's the type, for row at index path, pass in the index path. So the for row at index path is the external parameter name, and then index path is the internal parameter name for this function. So in our configure cell method, we're just going to set the text on the text label to hello for now. And you'll notice that UI label with a question mark, this is an optional. UI label, the text label is an optional in Swift. So we need to unwrap it with a question mark and then set the text. If text label happens to be nil, then the text won't be set. So using the question mark operator to unwrap optionals in Swift is fairly safe. It allows us to get the value if it exists, and if it doesn't exist, or if the value is nil, the app doesn't crash, and generally speaking, just nothing happens. If we use the force unwrap syntax, the exclamation point, the app can and will crash if the value isn't nil. And here we are, we have our table view with one cell in it showing the text hello. So we can return 5 cells and we should get hello 5 times, and indeed we do. We're going to create a new file now, and this is part of the MVVM pattern. So we need a new Cocoa Touch class, and this will be our view model. And we're going to make it a subclass of NSObject, just because that allows us to configure it in our storyboard. Swift classes don't have to inherit from NSObject, but they can. Save it wherever you like. And adding it to the Top Movies test target will allow us to test the view model later. So if you want to do some testing later on, go ahead and add that to the Top Movies tests. Okay, so now we have our view model object. So let's go back to the view controller and use that object. We'll start by declaring a view model property. And we're going to make it optional with the exclamation point here, making it an implicitly unwrapped optional. We'll also declare it as an IB outlet. And this is why we know that using the exclamation point will be safe, because we know it'll be set by the storyboard. So let's go to the storyboard now and hook it up. So in our scene, in our view controller scene, we can add another object. Okay, and if you drag it up to the top there, get it to show up, you can drop that object right on that top bar, and then we can set the class of the object, the custom class. We'll set it to view model to match our view model class that we just created, and this is where it needs to be a subclass of NSObject. Now we can also hook up our view model from the view controller to that object we've dropped onto the scene. And this allows us to do some dependency injection from the storyboard. So our storyboard is passing in the view model object that we need here. And so now we'll ask our view model for the number of items in the section, passing in the section, And of course that method, that function doesn't exist yet. That method is not there on the view model. So we'll go to the view model and define it. So it's called number of items in section. It takes a section integer and it returns an int. So for now we'll hard code it to 10. And now everything should build just fine, and it should run and show hello 10 times now. Now for the text, we want to get that from the view model as well. So our view controller shouldn't do any of this setting text or anything like that. If we pass that off to the view model, that keeps our view controller a little smaller. So we'll define a method called title for item at index path in our view model. We'll pass in an index path, and it should return a string. So for now, again, we'll hard code a string, and we'll just say hi. And there, indeed, we have hi showing up 10 times in our view controller. Okay, so now that we have our view model created, we also want to have a new client class to access our data from the API. So it's going to be a Cocoa Touch class. It's going to be called Movies Client, and this again will fetch the movies from the API. Subclass of NSObject, and the language is Swift. And I'll reorganize my project structure a little bit here. So our view model is what we'll need to call this class. So let's go to the view model and let's give it a property. I'm sorry, let's start with the function, fetch movies function. Okay, and the completion is going to be a closure. So notice that syntax there. And this will be called by our view controller, so that it can tell the view model to fetch the movies, which will then tell the movies client to fetch the movies. So we're going to do that now. Let's ask the movies client to fetch the movies, and when it's finished, we're going to execute this code block here. So the curly brace syntax lets us pass in a closure as the parameter for the fetch movies method that we're calling a movies client. So it's movies in, and then once we get the movies, we're going to set it on a property in our class here. So let's go up and define our property. So movies is going to be what holds the data from the iTunes RSS feed, and again, this is what it looks like. So we have this entry here, which is an array. So that's the data we're going to store in our movies array. So that entry, it's an array, has categories and all that stuff. But let's go ahead and create it as an array of NS dictionaries. So the square bracket syntax for an array, NS dictionary inside of it, saying that this is an array of dictionaries, and it's optional because it may be nil, and in fact movies will be nil at first. And then we have the movies client, which is also an optional. We're going to mark it with an exclamation point because we know that it's not going to be nil in here because it'll be injected from the storyboard. Let's go to the movies client now and define that fetch movies function. So again, it's going to take a closure. And remember, this is what we just called from our view model. So that completion block will be, that closure will be executed after the movies are fetched. And we're going to set the parameter to that closure to movies, which will be an NS dictionary. So first we want to fetch the data, and then when we're finished, once we have that data, we're going to call the completion block. So let's get started fetching the data. we're going to use the NSURL session API. So we need an NSURL session, and I'm thinking in Objective-C here. This is Swift. So let session equal NSURL session, and we'll pass in a configuration. We can use the default configuration for NSURL session configuration. And of course we need our data task with our request and completion handler. I'm sorry, URL. So let's define our URL above. The string is this from the iTunes API. And then let's pass in the URL to that data task with URL. So we need to construct a URL, and it's NSURL string as the constructor. And it's complaining about this because that NSURL with string may return nil, because maybe we're passing in a string that's not actually a URL. So we can insert the exclamation point in this case because we know that it's not going to be nil. Okay, and of course we need to call task.resume. Sorry, I misspoke earlier about the data task with URL. We do need the completion handler. So again, we're going to need to pass in a URL. So let's create it up here at the top, pass in the string, and we will need the exclamation point to unwrap that optional. So we pass in the URL to our method below, pass in a completion handler, which is a closure. So these are the parameters to the closure, and then the return type of the closure is void. And then this inside of here will execute our code. So this is where we can take the data, the response, and the error and operate on those. So if we get an error, so if error is not equal to nil, then we want to handle that somehow. The easiest way is probably just to call the completion block and return nil. And I realize I don't want to call the completion block with movies, passing in the movies name parameter name, so I'm going to just remove movies from both places here. So now we can just call completion, pass in nil, and in order to pass in the nil, that needs to be optional. So it's an optional array of dictionaries. And again, going back to my URL, it needs to be unwrapped optional. So we're saying there in the let URL that NSURL will not be nil. If it is nil, it's going to crash. Okay, and then we can return. And then next, to do, this is something we're not going to look at right now, but we should probably check the response status code to see if it's in the acceptable range of status codes. So moving on, let's go to create our JSON object with data from NSJSON serialization. And we're using the if-let syntax here. That if-let will unwrap the optional. So this is another way of unwrapping optionals. Because JSON object with data could potentially return nil, we want to see if it's nil. If it's not nil, then what's inside the block will get executed. And for our JSON error, we're just going to create an NS error, which is also optional. Okay, so again, if JSON object with data returns an object, if it's not nil, then we can, inside this block will be executed. Let's fix that error and say as, looking again at our feed, this should be an NS dictionary that's returned from the JSON that we're parsing. So again, looking at the JSON, the movies are in the feed entry. So we're going to do a value for key path. and feed.entry. So that's based on the JSON. We're just parsing the JSON here into a movies array, which is, again, a dictionary. And this we should do the optional unwrapping as well. Optional binding is what this is called. So we expect feed.entry to be an array of NS dictionaries, and we're going to call the completion block on movies. This, as with a question mark, we'll try to unwrap it, but if it fails, then movies would be nil, and this block wouldn't get executed. Okay, so we've called our completion block and return from that. So back in our view model, now looking at the fetch movies method, it should return our movies, and then we can use our movies property to return the number of items in a section. This needs to not be optional. It needs to actually return an int. Right now it could return nil because movies might be nil. So in order to get around that, we can use the double question mark syntax. So if movies is nil, there's no count, then return 0. And we're going to use the same syntax for the title for item at index path. So check movies. If it's not nil, get the item at this index path. And from that item, we need to look at the movie title. So that's under entry. It's the imName.label, I believe. Yeah, right there it is. So im:\name.label is the key path that we want. And if that's nil, then we'll just return the empty string. So hopefully we get a string there. If we don't get a string from that whole line, then we'll just return the empty string. That's what this operator is doing. This is called the nil coalescing operator in Swift. Other languages call it the null coalescing operator or the Elvis operator. And it either returns the value coming from movies index path row, value for key path as string, or if that's nil, it returns the empty string on the other side of it. Okay, so back in our view controller, now we need to ask our view model to fetch those movies as soon as the view loads. So in view.load, we'll call fetch movies, passing in a closure. And to do that, and inside of that, we need to tell our table view to reload data. And it's going to complain because we don't have a table view yet, so we need to create our table view property. So that also is an IB outlet. It's a var table view, and it's a UI table view type. So let's go back to the storyboard. So let's go in and hook that table view up. We'll create a new referencing outlet to our view controller, and that should be the table view. So back in our view controller, our table view is connected now. We don't need our did receive memory warning. And this should all work. Should fetch our movies and display them. Okay, and it looks like we have an error here. We have a crash here. So movies client isn't being created yet. So just like we did with the view model, we'll drop in our client, an object for our movies client, and then we'll set the class on that to movies client. So the storyboard will instantiate this for us. So we need to set the property from our view model to our movies client. And to do that, we need to mark the property as an IB outlet. So at IB outlet will let us do that. And then back in the storyboard, we should be able to control, drag, not option, control, drag from the view model to the movies client. Okay, and we don't have data still. So what are we missing here? Let's make sure our view controller, it's fetching the movies, it's calling reload data. Oh, we missed calling our completion block in the view model. So of course, when we fetch the movies, we need to call completion so that reload data can be called. And I think that should do it for us. Let's try it. Okay, they're still not showing up, but when we scroll, they are. So this is clearly just a threading issue. We need to do it on the main thread. So I'm going to go back to the view model, and inside of fetch movies, we need to dispatch async to run this on the main queue, and we'll pass in the block using the trailing closure syntax, and then inside of it we'll call self.tableview.reload data on the main thread, and that does it for us. Our movies are displayed immediately. Now I notice that our view is cut off a little bit at the bottom, so let's fix that by adding auto layout constraints. So we'll select our table view, and then down at the bottom of the storyboard we'll add our constraints. So we don't want to constrain to margins, but we do want all of the edges selected. So we'll do that and add them. And there we have it. We are displaying all of our movies, and everything's good.